Hebrews 11 teaches us how faith affects all of our lives. And as we look at the story of Abraham in Hebrews chapter 11, as Hebrews 11 has a lot to say about Abraham, but the first thing it teaches us about Abraham is that faith dramatically changes the way we even think about the course of our lives. It affects our priorities. It affects the things that we want to accomplish and want to achieve. It might even affect the dreams that we have for our lives. And so we want to look at the story of Abraham, and especially the beginning of Abraham's story from the book of Genesis, and see how he teaches us how to live a life of faith that's even contrary to the American dream. And so let's look first at what Hebrews has to say about Abraham. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. At the very beginning of the story of Abraham in Genesis, we learn some important things about faith. First of all, we learn that faith leads us into the unknown. Now, I don't know if you know much about Abraham, but Abraham is the father of the Hebrew nation. And he's also the patriarch for all people of faith in God, because the New Testament says that anybody who trusts in God's promises, anyone who believes in God with just that simple, pure faith, they are like a child of Abraham, because Abraham did that before God. And what you need to know about Abraham is that when God first called him, Abraham was a nobody. Abraham was from this kind of area of the Middle East. There was nothing particularly impressive about Abraham. He was just a regular guy until one day God called him. The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you." This was God's introduction to Abraham, whose name at this point was Abram. God, who he didn't know, comes to Abraham and he says, "I want you to leave everything you know, all your dreams, all your plans, all your priorities. I want you to leave those all behind, and I want you to come with me to the unknown." And, God promised Abraham a number of things, but still, Abraham had to take this step of faith into the unknown. Well, what was Abraham's response? So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. This verse shows us why Abraham is a great example of the life of faith, because Abraham, at 75 years old, walks into the unknown. And God calls us into the unknown with our lives. Faith calls us into the unknown. Faith calls us to give up or set aside our dreams. So many of us have a dream, like an American dream. And by that, I mean sort of the contemporary American dream, which is, maybe a great family or a nice house or new cars or security, all these things. And God calls us to trust him with our future. That's what I mean by the unknown, the future. God doesn't always give us everything we want the moment we ask for it or the moment we desire it, or he may never even give us some of our desires. But faith calls us to trust God in the unknown, trusting that God's plan for our lives and God's purpose for our life, God's greater purpose for our life, is much better than we could ever imagine. And that wild idea only comes from a life of faith. But there's something else we learn about faith from this story. Faith forces us to change our priorities. Now, I don't know what Abraham's priorities were before God called him, but I'm pretty sure his priority wasn't at 75 years old to leave his family, leave all of his business investments behind, and wander into the desert. But that's exactly what he did, because God led him. And I don't know what your priorities were before you became a Christian, or even if your priorities are now, if you're not yet a Christian. But many Americans, they prioritize things like money and security, influence, power. We want to build these things in our lives. We want to have these things. And yet God comes along and God says what we should seek after most with our lives is a relationship with God, things that matter to God, things that are important to God. And things like money and security and power and influence are completely unimportant to God. And so that's why this is really Abraham versus the American dream, because a life of faith is going to cause us to change our priorities and to refocus our lives and to spend our lives focusing on things that matter to God. Jesus himself reinforced this idea. Seek the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and he will give you everything you need. As Christians, God is our priority. A bigger house isn't a priority. A better job isn't a priority. Longer vacations, that's not our priority. God is our priority as Christians. Seek first God, and then God will take care of everything else. And there's one more thing we learn about faith from this story. Faith focuses on the eternal. Look at how Hebrews ends this section. And even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith. For he was like a foreigner living in tents. And so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. Abraham reached the promised land, but even while he was there, he lived as a nomad. He lived in tents, and so did his son and his grandson. And Hebrews tells us that Abraham wasn't frustrated by this or angered by it. He was looking for an eternal city. And this is the hope of eternity. The reason why I feel like I can tell you to give up the American dream and follow God's dream for your life is because God gives us an eternal hope, an eternal future. If you prioritize what matters to God, you're prioritizing what will matter for all eternity. You are investing in things a lot more important than your money or your house or even just your future here on earth. You are investing in eternity, and there is nothing better than that. And that is why the lesson of Abraham is a powerful example of faith for every day of your life.